And we've not heard a lot of suggestions, maybe exactly none, I think.
We've had lots of people encourage us to continue a study, but we've not had a book. Yeah.
So our plan is, as of Monday, we will jump into the Gospel of Mark. We hope that will be an interesting discussion. Gospel of Mark has a lot in it, as do all the Gospels, that will challenge us and speak to us. And so we think that would be a good place for us to invest some time, and hope that you'll be able to join us and plug along with us. But unless Revelation strikes us, not the book, but the actual thing, we will plan on doing Mark
Revelations
next week. So today, that finds us in the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, an interesting chapter, and one of, to my knowledge, Michael, very few, I can think of two others, one of very few chapters in the scripture attributed to a woman.
Yep.
The teaching of King Lemuel's mother. And King Lemuel is not known. It's possible he's an Israelite, but he's not listed among the kings of Israel or Judah. So as is the case we mentioned with the sayings of Gewecke, we don't know who this is. We really don't have a sense of who Lemuel is or why his mother is writing things that end up in our Bible. But they fit very much in Proverbs. 95% of this chapter is about women, which is fitting, having theoretically been written by a woman. And also, the idea of giving a king advice is interesting. Mm-hmm. That probably a small circle, whoever King Lemuel was, probably a small circle of people who could tell him what to do. Not surprisingly, his mother is one of them. So we have up through verse 9 as this kind of general proverbs that we've seen before, though several of them are hooked together. And then the back part of the chapter from 10 on we'll talk about separately, because it's very interesting and historically a little bit interesting as well. So let's jump in. Michael, what do you have?
Yeah, you may or may not disagree with this, Clint. I feel like a great controlling theme of these first 9 verses is moderation. And what I mean by that is there's this sense, in verse 3, do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. Verse 4, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire a strong drink. There's this sense here that moderation is required if one is to live rightly. If one is going to behave in the world with good character and in upright, just ways, you can't give yourself over to your pleasures. And in this sense, don't give yourself to women in an unhelpful way. Don't give yourself to strong drink in an unhelpful way. I hear in that a kind of call to moderate living.
Right, and again, if we read this through the lens of the Proverbs, this is given to a leader. And think about world leaders, think about American politicians, how many of those paths have been sidetracked or ruined by improper relationships, alcohol, drugs, etc. The idea of the danger of excess and of giving into it in whatever area of one's life. And imagine those were the warnings given to a king. Now, you're going to have the power to do whatever you want, but if you do whatever you want, those things themselves will threaten to destroy you. So then I would jump down to verse 6, give strong drink to one who is perishing and wine to those in bitter distress. This may sound counterintuitive, but this is the idea of compassion. Don't withhold comfort when people are suffering. The image here in verse 6 is probably literally when people are dying. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. The closest we probably come to this is one of the tenets of hospice, which is end-of-life care, and the idea that they will give the medicine needed for a person to stay comfortable. And at that point, the dangers of those medicines really are no longer a concern, and they can use those medicines to effectively manage pain at the end of life, which I think is part of the idea here. But behind that, I think it's a broader appeal to a king, to a ruler, to be compassionate, to care about even those below them who are suffering, and to ease that suffering when possible.
I guess I just was going to keep on going, Clint. Verse 8
Yeah,
and 9.
absolutely.
Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. This idea of speaking out is in very many ways contemporary. We use this language even now about sort of speaking out about things. And I think, Clint, it's good to be reminded that this leader, this king ostensibly, is being reminded that whatever voice you have been given in leadership should be used for the sake of the least in your kingdom. That's a theme that Jesus is going to name explicitly in the New Testament. That's going to be a core part of his teaching. And here to see it delivered to a leader, I think, is unbelievably instructive. To whatever extent you and I lead, we are called to speak out for those who may not be able to speak for themselves. And that requires some empathy. That requires some humility to see the others around us, even when we're caught up in our own lives. This is a call, I think, both to the greatest and I guess, a sense to the least, but more explicitly here to the greatest, to use the gifts that you've been given for the sake of those who don't have those gifts.
And what I think is fascinating about these verses, Michael, is that, again, they illustrate for us that wisdom is found in knowing what is appropriate in the moment, because we have encountered throughout the book of Proverbs the idea of bite your tongue, be silent, use your words sparingly, use your words judiciously. And we had this phrase that we bumped into a while back, the wisest word is sometimes the one unspoken. But in this context, when people are suffering and have no one to speak for them, the most dangerous word is the word unspoken.
Yeah.
That faithfulness in that moment means being willing, being able to step out and have the courage to speak. In other moments, wisdom means biting the word that didn't need to be said and keeping it in your mouth. And again, just the idea that both of those things are true, and wisdom is the ability to navigate which is true in the moment you're in. I think that's one of the real gifts that Proverbs has given me as I've read through it this time, is that realization again that wisdom is not a checklist.
Right.
It is a kind of ability to determine what is appropriate in the moment.
Yeah, and this really changes, not tone, but we very much see this chapter go into a different gear as we move to verse 10 and beyond. My Bible has the subheading, Ode to a Capable Wife. You might also say that this highlights the virtues of a strong woman, and that's been read differently throughout history. But we turn into this sort of affirmations of what a woman of character, a woman of strength looks like.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to say on the front end, Michael, we understand that on one hand, this is the crowning thing that the Old Testament has to say about females. I mean, in many ways, this is the Old Testament celebration of what it would have considered femininity in its day. On the other hand, it is horribly dated. It is still viewed through the lens of how a woman is helpful or beneficial to a man. And it's not really, as we would consider it, a celebration of women in and of themselves, their own right. So there's a sense in which you could call this feminist, and there is another sense in which feminists would hate this passage. Yeah. But if you're able to not be offended by it, I do think there are some things here. I've read this occasionally at funerals of matriarch type women, and I've said that the things that were appreciated in a woman in this passage are still appreciated: industriousness, intelligence, integrity, the things that made for a capable, for a commendable woman, I think in many ways are simply true of people to
Right.
start with.
Yep.
And maybe that's the problem. Maybe this could have just been called Ode to a... So this is both affirming and sexist all at once, depending on how you want to read it. And I think you and I have different experiences of it, because
Yeah.
I came to this text late, and it was not a part of the language of my childhood or my early faith formation. I didn't even know this was in here for many, many, many years, nor did anyone make a big deal out of it. I suppose maybe they didn't know what to do with it. So for me, it didn't bring with it a lot of baggage, and I think I was able to read in it fairly easily the celebration aspect and not be put off by maybe the ways it has been used, because in my experience it wasn't used, and so I got to encounter the text and for the most part I could pick out the best parts of it and go, oh, that's nice. I think you had a different experience.
Yeah, I did. I grew up in a more conservative church family situation in which this text was more likely to be read, and in fact I heard preached numerous times as a kind of societal expectation of women, that this laid out a roadmap for what the modern Christian woman should look like. And to some extent, I would point here to verse 12 to be a specific version of what you shared before, Clint. It says, she does him, meaning her husband, good and not harm all the days of her life. You see how that's pointed at her utility to the male. Now, that's one verse out of many. But you can see how if one builds a theology around verses like that, a woman becomes sort of a person in orbit around a single point in their life. And I don't think that we need to point to just cultural advancement to see that that's not really what Scripture has in mind. And I think you can look within the book of Proverbs. Let us remember, wisdom has been personified as a female throughout this entire book. There's this idea, I think that maybe wasn't intrinsic to the original writer, but we can now see that there is wisdom that comes from a woman's perspective, that though it has not always historically been heard, it's right and good and needs added. But then I think, Clint, there's places that cut against that. I would point to verse 16. You called it industriousness. She considers a field and buys it with the fruit of her hands. She plants a vineyard. We've seen passages like this throughout this entire book, encouraging us to think about hard work, to put your hand to the plow, to till, to work hard, that it'll be good for the person who puts themselves to the task at hand. And here we have this applied to a woman, which is maybe not to us culturally challenging, but there it would have. And so I think the idea that the woman should consider to buy a field, a thing that she wouldn't have legal rights to do when this was written, is a thing that I think we can be encouraged by, that women should not in any way sort of live in some sort of abstract orbit around a person or a gender, but rather they, as women, I mean, should submit to the wisdom of the rest of the book, that we're all called to that same task.
And I think if we can do that, if we can approach a passage like this and recognize that it may not be what we would have written, or it may not characterize what we wish it did fully, we can appreciate the things that it says. For instance, verse 20, she opens her hand to the poor. She reaches out her hands to the needy. We have seen exclusively throughout this book, that's what wise people do. She's not afraid for her household when it snows. Verse 25, strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom. Verse 26, teaching kindness on her tongue. We see in the presentation of a wise woman here the characteristics that we've seen throughout the rest of the book.
Yep.
And that is truly a celebration. And I think for those of us, I had the good fortune to grow up with strong women. And so as I read this and as I can sort of translate the datedness of it I can see in those women things that I admire, things that I appreciate. I can see the outworking of wisdom in their lives. And, I think it is a very high compliment in its own voice, a verse like, 29, many women have done excellently, but you pass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands. So it is fascinating that you can almost interchange the pronouns here, she and her, with the word wisdom itself in many cases. Yep. And again, this unfortunately stands out as exceedingly high praise for women and for a woman amongst the texts of the Old Testament. There's not a lot, there's not enough of this kind of thing in the book. And so rather than be upset that it's a product of its time, I think we are better served to be invited to see how that dated language can raise and celebrate our idea of womanhood.
I don't think we're doing anything different in this text than we have done previously. We've tried to trouble some of the young man directives in a way that said, there's wisdom in this regardless of your gender. I think here we look to verse 30. It's a verse I've highlighted. I think this is the kind of thing that you would want a young woman, even today, to know when they go to Spirit Lake High School. You would want your daughter to know charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Now, that's also true for the guy who's driven by the same vanity, all right? That's not contained to females. But it is to say that is still a cultural temptation, that how I look when I go into this space has something to say about my value. Well, to whatever extent we buy that lie, it's good to be reminded that ultimately is the fear of the Lord that matters. And so once again, I think you look to verse 31, give her a share in the fruit of her hands. The idea that a woman should have some result from her actions, that she has agency in the world. That's another good lesson that you would want to pass on to a daughter, that what you do matters more than just what you look like or how you present. That's not every young woman's struggle, but to the young woman who needs to hear it, these are strong words.
Yeah, and is it fair, Michael, that maybe part of what we're trying to say is that these verses, though a celebration, are sort of dated and contextual, and unfortunately have been used to kind of, through the years, try and reinforce their context instead of their meaning.
Right.
And
yeah,
I think that what we want to say is, yes, they're dated, but in their time, they're also revolutionary. And if you've been fortunate, I think most of us have, to know a godly woman who, deeply cared for her family, and who honored her husband as a partner and worked together, that when we see that, it is to be celebrated because it's a beautiful and wonderful thing, male or female. But the Bible has all kinds of things to say about men. So I think that it is fortunate for us that we get this moment where we can highlight specifically the faithful women in our lives.
Yeah, and it's fitting that this is the end of our study of the book of Proverbs. It's a moment where we really close some of those themes, because Clint, I think we can honestly say this does not introduce any substantive content we haven't seen before. Mm-hmm. We've seen all of these themes: generosity, humility, fear of the Lord. All of this stuff we have already seen given in a variety of different proverbs. And so to now see it framed in the feminine, I think is a gift. And it's a way that you can close this book, as long as, and this is maybe my final note on this, as long as we refrain from using it as a weapon against women, and rather a celebration of the good gifts we see God portraying in women, then I think we have a lot to be thankful for here.
I would agree. It's an interesting place to end a book. It's an interesting passage to discuss. Hope there's something in it that was helpful for all of us, and hope you've enjoyed Proverbs. It's again, there's not another book certainly like Proverbs. There are other sections of books a little bit like it, but it stands out as unique in the Scripture. Not an easy book in many ways to study, but something that is big enough. I suspect we all find a challenge in it at some point. So we hope that you did, hope that you are more familiar and comfortable with it, and hope you've enjoyed it.
It's a good last word, Clint. We look forward to seeing you next week as we begin the Gospel of Mark together. But until then, be blessed.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. This is a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.